Hegseth would like to do is he'd like to end the war in Ukraine. He'd like to strike a deal with Iran, and he'd like to concentrate on containing China, and all at the same time keeping his mouth shut on the genocide in Gaza. And that's basically Trump's policy.
So recently, John Mearsheimer, the legendary geopolitical analyst, was on Judging Freedom, Andrew Napolitano's podcast, to talk about all the hullabaloo over Pete Hegseth, the Secretary of Defense, all the calls for him to resign, what may be producing it, and whether he can survive all this. So let's watch and let's react.
I want to ask you about Secretary of Defense Hegseth. You are, of course, a graduate of West Point and a veteran of the United States Air Force, in addition to your spectacular academic credentials. How do you think the troops feel about these allegations of his indifference towards the maintenance of state secrets?
Well, my sense from reading the media is that the troops, and this would include a lot of the generals and admirals, were very skeptical about him to begin with. He has no managerial experience. He's done a number of things in his lifetime that make him look like a person who doesn't really have good judgment, not the sort of person you'd want to be making important national security decisions. So I'm sure there were huge amounts of doubters, huge numbers of doubters in the Pentagon and in the military more generally before he took over. But I think that everything everyone has seen up to this point makes it clear that he's really not up for the job. The whole business with these signal phone calls or signal calls show really serious lack of judgment.
Okay, so I have to disagree a little bit with Mearsheimer here. There's been various reports on various sides regarding what the troops' sensibilities are toward Hegseth and whether they like him or not. He is known to be nitty and gritty, get in with the enlisted men, do physical training with them, and a lot of people seem to like him for that reason. So I've seen a lot of reports from troops that really like Hegseth for those reasons, and I can see why. Enlisted men go through the runner, put to the test so many times, and to have the Secretary of Defense, it's the highest ranking military official, kind of in the mix with you, doing training with you, that's like a big deal to a lot of people. I'm sure there's skepticism amongst high-ranking generals, no question about that. It's true that Hegseth has shown some lack of judgment in his personal life with infidelities and things like that. But the signal leak factor that no one is talking about is the leak itself seems to have been Mike Waltz's fault. Though I'm not absolving Hegseth of wrongdoing, his comments in there led me to believe that he was more concerned about how to sell the strikes against Yemen rather than whether it was constitutionally or morally legitimate as far as an action goes. And only really J.D. Vance put up a stink against that at first, and then he kind of, went in with the rest of them on it in support of it. But we'll have to see here, because I don't completely agree from what's being divulged over the last few days that Hegseth is just willy-nilly about letting state secrets go. And I think that a lot of the things that have happened show that, especially regarding the firings of his subordinates recently and how that turned out.
And so I think that there are probably a lot of people in the military who'd like to see him go.
Chris, do we still have Congressman Moulton? Congressman Moulton is also an officer in the Army National Guard, the moderate Democrat from Massachusetts, pretty angry.
Hegseth continues to lie about this. He's not taking accountability for his own actions. And as a result, he cannot be trusted. He's clearly not trusted by his own closest advisors. What do you think the troops think about him? Well, I know, because I've heard from a lot of them, that they are disgusted by this behavior from the top person in the Pentagon, because they know that they would be fired in a heartbeat, probably prosecuted criminally, if they did what the Secretary of Defense has done and is now lying about himself.
Of that young National Guardsman from Massachusetts, Jack Teixeira, who's sitting in a jail cell for 15 years because he shared some military secrets with his buddies on one of these very chats. I don't know if it was Signal or Telegram or
to share shared secrets on Discord, and one of the key ones that, again, this has been shoved under the rug by the corporate media, divulged that the U.S. actually had boots on the ground in Ukraine before that was ever revealed to the public. In fact, there were contradictory statements from the government and the Biden administration as to whether that the U.S. actually had boots on the ground, and he revealed that there were special forces from the U.S. on the ground in Ukraine fighting against Russia.
Or what it was. Does Congressman Moulton have a handle on this with which you agree?
I agreed with him before I heard what he just had to say, but the advantage that he has over me is he's actually talked to people in the military where I have not, and they are saying what logic tells you they are likely to say. I mean, the fact is that his behavior, I mean, if you just look at his relationship with his principal advisors, some of whom have been marched out of the Pentagon and a number of whom look like they're no more competent than he is. And you say to yourself, these are the people who are running national security for the United States, or at least running the Defense Department. And it's kind of a frightening thought.
I couldn't disagree with Mearsheimer more than this. In fact, I can't even think of something, in the recent past that I've disagreed with Mearsheimer more than this. All right. So the three subordinates that recently got fired, Hegseth's subordinates, two of the three, Darren Selnick and Dan Caldwell, both got exonerated of having leaked secrets. That was the initial accusation. Pete Hegseth stood in front of the media and said, hey, we're conducting an investigation, but we think from what we've seen that they leaked secrets. At least two of those men, as of the time of this video being recorded, had been exonerated. And Dan Caldwell actually went on the Tucker Carlson podcast and looked remarkably competent. And it seems as if there is a deep state attempt to push non-interventionists out of the Pentagon, because that's what Dan Caldwell clearly was. He sees the greater saber rattling in the Middle East as a mistake. He didn't want to strike against Iran. And if Selnick and Caldwell had feelings of, antipathy toward Hegseth after those things, I could hardly blame them. If I had been fired for no wrongdoing of my own, which these exonerations have revealed and have been reported in the corporate media, I would probably be upset at Hegseth too. But I actually think there's a deep state attempt to remove Hegseth himself. Because if Hegseth told Trump, hey, I think we should strike Iran, greenlight whatever Israel wants to do there, up to and including regime change, you wouldn't see these stories about Hegseth. You never see them about the neocons like Mike Waltz. The corporate media never urged Trump to fire Mike Waltz or Marco Rubio or John Ratcliffe or the fiercest defenders of the war regime and the Israel lobby. You've never seen it. But I think it was because that Hegseth urged restraint to Trump. Like, we shouldn't strike Iran and we shouldn't support an Israeli strike in Iran. That is why you're seeing these stories. And I think that Hegseth fell for it at first by kind of standing by the deep state and saying these guys were leakers. But since what we've seen from that makes it seem like Hegseth himself and his subordinates are being targeted so that they can be replaced with more pliable, amiable people that will support warfare, extending warfare theaters, and striking Iran.
Colonel Macgregor's view is that President Trump probably doesn't care. That Trump views himself as the ultimate decider, and as long as he has loyalty and charm and good looks in his Secretary of Defense, he doesn't care. Do you share that view? I mean, if that's true, it's very telling.
Well, I think, first of all, Trump appointed a number of people to important positions in his administration who I did not think were qualified for the job. This is not a case where I thought that people's views were wrong. I just didn't think they were competent. And I found it quite shocking that he appointed those people. And I think, generally speaking, President Trump doesn't care that much about how competent certain people are who are filling certain positions. I think, though, you don't want to lose sight of the fact that there was not much daylight between Hegseth and Trump, or there is not much daylight between Hegseth and Trump on China, Ukraine, and Iran. What Hegseth would like to do is he'd like to end the war in Ukraine. He'd like to strike a deal with Iran, and he'd like to concentrate on containing China, and all at the same time keeping his mouth shut on the genocide in Gaza. And that's basically Trump's policy. I think you could make an argument that the four people who are sort of with Trump are Musk, Steve Witkoff, J.D. Vance, and Hegseth. So I think that Hegseth is someone who Trump likes in good part because there's not much daylight between them on the key policy issues.
Nice.
Yeah, I mostly agree with that. Hegseth does seem to share the general proclivities toward foreign policy that Trump does. Also, there's word that Trump really liked him on Fox News when he had a show there. And in some ways, he's like Trump himself. He's got some charisma. He's got some humor. He presents to people at least uniquely in some regard. And that's something that Trump seems drawn to. But again, like I said, I really think that the deep state's trying to push him out over this Iran thing. And more information has come up about that yesterday, including Trump giving an interview to, I think it was Time, saying, you know, I didn't really completely put a kibosh on that Israel couldn't do that. And I won't swear that the U.S. won't be involved if Israel chooses to strike unilaterally, which is really disappointing because at one point I was like, great, if Trump really stopped this, that's commendable. It's another reason to like Trump. But it seems like Trump himself has walked that back a little bit. But either way, if Pete Hegseth was in this Tulsi Gabbard group, this J.D. Vance group that urged restraint, he deserves some, again, commendation for that, some adulation and some praise, because not everyone in Trump's cabinet is like that, especially Mike Waltz and Marco Rubio. And Huckabee doesn't even believe that there are any legitimate settlements on the West Bank and in Gaza. So we'll have to see what comes from this. I've had mixed feelings about Hegseth from the beginning, but especially in regard to his position with Yemen. But I think he's right on the mark when it comes to Iran so far from what I've heard. And Dan Caldwell was remarkably competent. I can't believe Mearsheimer hasn't followed this, and depending on the timing of this, he might know more now. But it's not the case that all of those men were leakers. They deserve to have their names cleared, especially when the Pentagon itself is saying that they weren't leakers a few days later. So what do you guys think? Will Pete Hegseth remain the Secretary of Defense for much longer? Let me know in the comments below. And until I see you guys next time, no more war, no more debt, no more inflation, no more empire. Like the video, subscribe to the channel, and peace out. I'll talk to you guys later.